by apologizing to any German speakers in the room or just people of German descent in general. There's a lot of German names in this, and I'm sure I'm about to butcher all of them. But here we go nonetheless. There's a man by the name of Nicholas von Zinzendorf. He was a wealthy landowner. He was actually a noble. He was a count in Germany. Shortly after committing his life to Christ, this was somewhere during the Protestant Reformation. There was a lot of political fighting as a result of that. And over time, a group of people called the Moravians began to flee their homeland, flee the persecution they were feeling. And some of them sought refuge on his estate. And so over time, his estate filled up with about 300 Moravians. He took them in, and they began to live out what they saw in the book of Acts, where everyone had everything in common, where they ate house to house, where they fellowshiped together, breaking bread together. Very shortly after this, they began a prayer meeting in the church there. They started with the idea that they were going to pray for 24 hours. Someone from their church would, kind of like a prayer-a-thon, would sign up for the various hours of the day, and one day led to two, led to a week, led to a month. This prayer meeting is said to have lasted 100 years, where someone from that church committed to pray an hour, each of the hours of the day. This group of people on the move, these Moravians who were displaced from their homes, were ready to follow God anywhere. In 1731, Zinzendorf began sending missionaries. As a wealthy noble, he used his influence. He had the capacity to travel and to hear about faraway lands and people who needed to hear the gospel. And so he would take a trip, and he would witness some things, and he would come back to the church, and he would talk about the need. And they would call people up and send them out. But funding missionaries in this day, there were not missionary societies, as they called them back then, or boards and agencies, as we call them now. These didn't exist. And so one of the things that typified their method was the idea that people who had come to live on his estate and had brought their trade with them, they would take their trade and they would move overseas, and their daily work would help provide the basis for them being in a country. It would provide for their needs and create a platform for them to work. Now, this style of leadership at this time and place was quite radical, and probably the most radical sending of any of the missionaries was two young men who heard about a plantation owner who was an atheist in the West Indies. And this man prevented any pastor, any missionary from setting foot in his territory. He had quite a bit of land. And so their missionary strategy was to sell themselves into slavery to this man, because he had 3,000 slaves who didn't have access to the gospel. In the 10 years between 1732 and 1742, this small community of 600 people in Germany, they sent more than 70 missionaries. And by 1760, they had sent out about 226 missionaries in total. Pause for a moment. I think I asked this question at the beginning of this series on work. I asked the question, what does it take to reach a city like Seattle? What does it really take? Is it more churches? Is it more evangelism, more programs? What does it take? When you're thinking about Seattle, let's just throw other names in there: New York, Kuala Lumpur, Santiago, Lagos, Berlin. Think about cities around the world. What do these cities need? What would it take to reach them? If you were just sitting back and coming up with a strategy or a plan, what would you say? When we think about who needs to hear the gospel, when we think about Revelation 5:9, that around the throne, every nation and tribe and tongue and language is going to be gathered, what is it going to take? When we ask the question, well, do we need more missionaries? The obvious answer feels like, well, yes. On the other hand, when you start looking at the nuances of the challenge, you realize, well, the people who are yet to be reached, the 3,000 plus people groups who don't have access to the gospel, they don't live in places where most missionaries can go. So this comes back to the question, what will it take? How will they hear? If I had 100 people to reach a city like Seattle or any major city, I would say give me 98 kingdom-minded business people and 2 missionaries. You say, well, what are the 2 missionaries for? Well, this is the discipleship model of the missionaries work with the business people, of encouraging them and training them and keeping them organized. But it's the people who are out in the marketplace. They are the pointy end of the spear. The answer to this challenge, at least in part, is this idea that, though it's often attributed to Zinzendorf, this predates him by hundreds of years, and this idea is called business as mission. Very simply, it's the idea that one's work provides the funding, the visa, the platform, and the location, even the connections to do evangelistic work. This is one of the fastest growing mission trends in the world today. Tens of thousands of Christian Filipinos, Malaysians, Chinese, Nigerians, name the group. They are spreading across the world with their work, and they're using that as a platform to bring the gospel into people's homes. In the first two sermons, they were largely about the cultural commission from Genesis to fill the earth and subdue it. What does it mean to live out being image bearers with God? What does that really mean in our daily lives? The second two sermons were about the value of living out God's nature and bringing his blessing. What does it look like to be his representatives, his ambassadors from a moral perspective? So in essence, the first four sermons were kind of about God's mission in broad terms. What is God ultimately doing in the world? Now, typically when we start that question, we start with what is his specific mission right now in terms of the salvation of souls. But for the whole series, we've largely been focusing on what is his broad general mission that he was doing throughout all time. But today, I actually want us to look more specifically as how does our work provide us the space for us to be a witness to Jesus? We're going to be in Acts chapter 18 today. Paul is actually who I would point to as the first missionary on record to use this model of ministry. And I would say the marketplace itself was very central to his method. Paul, his custom was he would go to a new town and he would automatically start in the synagogue on day one. He would talk with the Jews. He would reason from the scriptures how Jesus was the Messiah. When they had had enough of that and were kind of kicking him to the curb, he would then go to the marketplace and he would talk with the business owners, the philosophers, just whoever was around and whoever would listen. And so the marketplace was a huge part of his ministry. George MacLeod, a Scottish theologian, he says, in talking about the integration of the cross and the marketplace, he says, I simply urge that the cross must be raised again at the center of the marketplace as well as on the steeple of the church. I am recovering the claim that Christ was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves, on the town garbage heap, at a crossroads so cosmopolitan that they had to write his title in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, at the kind of place where the cynics talked smut, and thieves cursed and soldiers gambled, because that is where he died, and that is what he died about, and this is where the churchman should be and what the churchman should be about. So as we're looking at Acts chapter 18, the context for this is Paul has just left Athens. Athens was a little bit of a different experience for him. He got brought into this kind of philosophical place where he was able to talk with the philosophers and the thinkers of the day. In this context, Paul is talking about God being borderless, that God established times and periods and borders so that people would seek him. And he's talking about the spread of people across the world. So here we look at people on the move. This is scene one. There'll be three scenes in this chapter that we look at. Scene one is people on the move. In Acts 18, verse 1 through 4, we'll read. It says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And after he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy, and his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. So here we have two new characters that are introduced to Paul's missionary journey as a husband-wife couple, Aquila and Priscilla. And it says that they are a native, or that he is a native of Pontus. I have this on a map because this is going to get confusing as we go through the chapter. So can we just show map number one? So this is map number one. So Pontus is about there in Turkey, possibly a little bit more to the west in Turkey. And so this is Aquila, who left northern Turkey, and he goes all the way to Rome. And the text says, because of Claudius, he had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So there was a forcible expulsion of all of the Jews. This is somewhat racist, if you think about it. Basically, they're taking one people group and saying, you're not welcome in our city, get out. And so Priscilla and Aquila are forced, because of this, they're forced to leave Rome. There's actually a Roman historian, Suetonius, who talks about this event in his book about the life of Claudius. And he says, since the Jews were constantly making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he calls Jesus Chrestus instead of Christ, but that's who he's talking about. He's saying the Jews were these rabble-rousers in Rome, and so Claudius kicked them out. And so from Rome then, Priscilla and Aquila head all the way to Corinth. And that is where they start working with Paul. In verse 3, it says, because they were the same trade, they stayed with him, for they were tent makers by trade. So here we have a mission team that consists of 3 people, a husband-wife couple, and we have Paul. This is a very small bench of workers. But Paul works and he engages with the synagogues on the weekend, and then during the week he's working with tent making. Now, tent making is not, it's not only for money. There's a group of philosophers at this time known as the Cynics. And the Cynics were sort of like hippies in our culture, right? So they're people that kind of didn't quite fit the norm of get married, get a job, get a house. They were very much outside of that, and they would criticize that. They were cynical about all of those things. They didn't like the greed. They didn't like the status and the prominence. They saw all of these things as problems. Also, because of this, they were poor, and they needed to beg money from people who had all of those things, and so it's a bit of a catch-22. But as Paul is working for himself, and we see him say this again in Thessalonians to the church there, he says, look, I came and I worked with my own hands so as not to be a burden to any of you. And he's saying, look, I'm not one of these lazy, cynic philosophers who's going to sit around and pontificate about the world, criticize you for the money you make, and then beg you to feed me at the end of the day because I have nothing. And so Paul and Priscilla and Aquila, they've taken up this trade of tent making. And they're living in the city, Corinth, where tons of artisans live. They did metalwork and all kinds of stuff. And here they are. If you want to look at the ratio, though, right here it's 3-to-1. It's a team of 3 for every 1 missionary. Curious about our numbers as CMA. The ratio of CMA members to missionaries is 3,600 to 1. 3,600 people in our denomination to 1. Or if you want to look at it, churches to missionaries, 31 churches to every 1 missionary. Now, I don't know how we feel about those numbers. They're neither good nor bad. They are. Coming from the Southern Baptist world, our numbers were almost identical to these. We had about 3,900 Baptists for every 1 of our missionaries. For the Moravians, though, it was 10-to-1. Get your head around that number. At a time when no one is sending missionaries, the first group who even thinks, what if we sent people overseas and they lived and worked as missionaries? They had a ratio of 10-to-1. But here we have in this team a very small team of people that are using their jobs and working in the city. Scene number 2 is we see that the ministry they're doing is in the context of conflict. This is normal for Paul at this point. Starting in verse 5, we'll continue reading. It says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent from now on. I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So there's a lot happening here. First, we see the mission team grows a little bit. It's no longer a team of 3, now it's a team of 5. They're joined by Silas and they're joined by Timothy. These are 2 of Paul's young people that he is mentoring. And this allows Paul the time and the space to be able to work full time in the synagogue. It says he devotes himself wholly to the word. So what's happening here in Corinth? There's a lot of conflict, and Paul gets frustrated and shakes the dust off his feet and goes away. Now, the funny thing is, he says, I'm no longer going to the Jews, I'm just going to go to the Gentiles. The very next town, first stop, is the synagogue again. And so this might have been more of how he was feeling and less of like an absolute declaration. But we have a lot of people that in the midst of all of this conflict, they're believing. Paul receives a dream to encourage him, hey, don't lose heart, I am with you, you're going to be okay, just keep speaking the word. Finally, the Jews rise up. They bring him before the tribunal. The tribunal basically says, hey, this is a theological debate. I don't care about this. Y'all handle it. And in response, they take a guy as kind of a proxy beating, and they beat him in front of the proconsul just to show how aggravated they are. There's a lot going on. It's kind of like Fight Club here in Corinth. And so Paul stayed in Corinth a full year and a half, and then he relocates. And so we see map number 2 here, if we can pull that up. So map number 2, okay, start with the yellow line. That's Priscilla and Aquila from northern Turkey to Rome to Corinth. And you see the green star, that's going to represent Paul. So in Corinth, right there in the middle, then they move all the way to the end of the line. If you're traveling, following the line, they move to the end of the line, and that is Ephesus. They cross the water there, and they're living in Ephesus together. This is where we see scene 3 develop, and this is discipleship, relationships, and mission. How do these 3 things go tied together? Starting in verse 24, we'll pick up the text again. It says, now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in spirit. He spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And he wished to cross to Achaia. The brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. So here we see Paul has linked up with Priscilla and Aquila. He's moved them yet to another city with him. They've had to change their whole world. Again, they're living in Ephesus, very different environment than living in Corinth. And at some point, Paul says, hey, actually, I'm going to continue on my journey, and I have some work to do. And he leaves Priscilla and Aquila right there in Ephesus. At the same time, though, God brings another person from Alexandria. His name is Apollos. Now, let's look at how Apollos is described. He's very eloquent. He's very well-spoken. He's compelling. He seems to be intelligent. But he's lacking something. He doesn't know the rest of the story. It says he knew up to the baptism of John, and that was it. And so you go, well, how do you not know the complete story of Jesus at this time? How are you preaching and don't know the rest of the story? Well, the answer is simple. They're not walking around with full copies of the Bible, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these are eyewitness accounts that are being handwritten. They're being copied, and the copies are being shared with other people. There's an oral version of people telling the stories that they heard or telling their own eyewitness accounts. But largely, when you read through the book of Acts, especially early in Acts, if you look at those sermons, look at the Acts 2 sermon, when they stand up after Pentecost and they preach the gospel. That sermon starts with, Our Father Abraham. To them, the gospel begins in the Old Testament. And so Apollos has this Old Testament version of, hey, it's the promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and through David, and there's this messianic line, and he's going to return the curse or change back the curse. He just hadn't heard about Jesus. And so here, Priscilla and Aquila, they're listening to him preach one day, and they go, wow, this guy's really great, except he doesn't get that whole Jesus thing. We need to help him. And so they take Apollos under their wings, and they begin to instruct him. They begin to disciple him in the completed story. Now, Apollos goes on, and he's a very influential personality in the New Testament. We don't hear a ton about him, but every time we hear about him, he's kind of doing a lot of stuff. Paul references him a number of times throughout his writings. Some scholars think he might even be the author of Hebrews. So that's one of those books where we don't exactly know who the author is, and people say, well, it sounds like Paul's theology, but maybe written in slightly different words than Paul would say it. Well, if it was Apollos who is instructed by some of Paul's right-hand people, it would make sense as to him being very much in Paul's theology, but maybe saying it in his own words. So I have map 3 here to show you, and this is kind of the final destination. So we have the yellow line from northern Turkey to Rome to Corinth to Ephesus. We have the green line going from Corinth to Ephesus, and then he goes on into Galatia, Paul does. And then we have Apollos coming from Alexandria up to Ephesus. But his journey wasn't done either. It says he wanted to go to Achaia. Achaia is the province where the city, Corinth, is located. If you ever read the book of Acts and said, I wonder how they always seem to just wander from city to city, and they're immediately welcomed into some new place. I mean, there's no, Yelp, there's no TripIt, there's none of that stuff. How did they know who to go to? I think this passage actually gives us potentially a look into how did the whole book work. And that is, it seems like as God was moving people along, remember the church starts in Jerusalem and then persecution hits and the church is spread as far as Antioch, and then it continues to spread from there. And so now this tight group of Christians is spread across the world. And then you can see where the team is moving from place to place to place. And now as Apollos is linking up with the team, he goes, hey, I want to go to the place that you guys just came from. And they said, hey, we'll write you letters. That's exactly what it says. They wrote him letters, and he was received very quickly, and he had an important ministry there. Now, my focus this morning is not so much on Apollos as it is on Priscilla and Aquila. They kind of take a little bit of a backseat role to a lot of the stories we find them in. But in Romans 16, 3-5, Paul gives them a special greeting in the closing of his letter. He says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house. They had risked their life for Paul, and Paul is saying, look, all of the Gentiles, all of the believers out here owe something. They owe tribute to Priscilla and Aquila. In fact, there's also a church meeting in their house. They were his helpers in Christ. So these people have been right there with Paul through much of this very difficult journey, many of these difficult years in Corinth. And I want to look at a couple of their qualities that we see throughout this story. The first one is that this couple was very mobile. We see them move from Pontus to Rome to Corinth to Ephesus. And then finally, Paul is writing to the Romans, so somehow they're back in Rome again. Though Acts doesn't tell us how, we just see that they're referenced in that letter. So this couple was on the move as God moved them from place to place. They said, well, we're going to set up shop here, and we're going to serve God where we're at until he moves us further on. God is sovereign over everything. They were faithful in every situation that God put them in. Sometimes God requires going somewhere. Sometimes he requires the move. Sometimes he requires staying. We saw both sides of that. They were willing to move with Paul, and when Paul went further in, they were willing to stay and be left. All geography belongs to God. We can't take our desired geography, whether we're saying, well, I want to stay right here and I don't ever want to move, or whether our only hope is to get out of here as fast as we can. We can't take either geography and turn that into an idol. We have to be careful that we're listening to the Holy Spirit as he opens doors and moves us. The second quality we see with Priscilla and Aquila is they were adaptable. They were hospitable hosts to Paul in a context of prejudice, opposition, persecution. They didn't let their surroundings send them into hiding. Their hospitality led them to service. They were willing to put their necks on the line. They were willing to travel, willing to go, willing to be left in Ephesus, willing to stay on track by coaching Apollos. They were willing to work as tent makers. I mean, this couple just seems to move and flex with everything that is thrown their way. Following God in mission has less to do about where you are and what title or organization you have, and more to do with following God, where God leads, with being the kind of person that he's called you to be in every single situation. The final quality we see about them is unity. We see them working together as a couple. They moved together, they worked together, they ministered together, they opened their home together. Marital issues relate to mission. If you're married, look at your partner for a moment. This is the person God gave you to fulfill his commands with. If your relationship isn't right at home, what are we calling people to? Sometimes we go and we want to talk about Jesus and he's got a great plan for their life without accepting the great plan he has for our life. We're saying, hey, look, God is going to transform your life without allowing him to transform our own life. This kind of transformation has to begin in our own heart, in our own marriage, in our own family, and then spread out from there. If you no longer have joy in what God has called your family to, maybe you've turned your calling into a chore. Or worse, maybe it's an idol. But burnout isn't always the sign of obedience. People will say things like, oh, you're not going to find anybody working harder for Jesus than me. I hear that in missionaries all the time. It's not necessarily a sign of obedience. Sometimes it's a sign of losing sight of Jesus. No one in our culture today tells us to be ordinary. All the pressure is do something special. Whether that's as a church, we need to be the church that really makes our mark. It's kind of the Babel complex, build a name for ourselves. But people do that on an individual basis. If I'm going to be involved in something, it's got to be special. It's got to be different. It's got to be unique. And we push for that. Here we see in Priscilla and Aquila, they were very ordinary. But they were very extraordinary at being ordinary. They were very dedicated to this path of ordinary life, of just moving along, working their job, staying with Paul, staying with Apollos, planting a church in their home. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. They're kind of this background character that if you just read through, you can kind of miss who they are in their story. And yet we see from the reference in Romans, Paul has such high regard for the work that they put in and the value they were to his team. Sometimes we need to focus on what is the daily discipline that God has called us to, even if it doesn't seem special or spectacular. Consider just for a moment how Priscilla and Aquila were used by God as traveling companion to Paul, as a supporter for the work in Corinth, as a discipler and trainer to Apollos. They are prime examples of this idea of business as mission, how they use their work to support God's specific mission, the mission of salvation. They're prime examples of people on the move, of being flexible, of not being tied to a homeland, of also not being tied to the place where God calls them to. That's another trait we see with people who go and serve God is, well, God called me to this new place, and I cannot serve God unless I'm in this place. I've heard people say this again and again. Well, yes, you can. God has need everywhere, and we see in the book of Acts where he just moves his people and moves them and moves them. There's not this sense of we are always tied to one time and place in order to serve God. They were so flexible and adaptable with all of the life change that God threw at them. I imagine that Aquila, when he left northern Turkey for the big city of Rome, that he had no idea all of the things that would transpire in his life. He did not know the journey that God was sending him on. I want to conclude with a couple of thoughts. Some Christians, we take the mentality of fighting the system. Whatever the system is for, let's be against the system. Let's band together and fight. And I just think of like a battleship, right? We've got these, a battleship's purpose is very clear. It's got those big guns all over the boat, and it's there to blow things out of the water or out of the land or out of the sky. Like it's just there to fight. And some Christians' mentality is this: if my company's for this, it's an agenda, I'm going to be against it. Others are maybe take more the metaphor of like a lifeboat. I'm just going to try to get away from whatever it is. I'm going to get away from the danger. The ship's going down, it's burning in flames. Let me just get out of here as quickly as I can. Some people are like a party boat. They're oblivious to what's going on. Ship can be going down around them. They're like, hey, another round, everybody. They're just going with the flow. My prayer for our church during this series has been not that we would be at war with our work, whatever that is, not that we'd be escaping our work or that we'd be oblivious to our work, but that we would engage and represent God's kingdom there, that we represent his justice and his love and his truth. And in this sermon, which is pushing it a little bit further and talking about the gospel specifically, that we would represent Jesus personally in the lives of those around us. Let me ask you some questions. Where is God calling you to be flexible? Where are you supposed to be open to his leading and moving in your life? Often dramatic and even difficult circumstances are used and redeemed by God to move us where he wants. This is the Joseph story, right? God literally allowed him to be taken as a slave, allowed him to be a prisoner, thrown into prison as part of his ultimate plan. These difficult circumstances moved him from place to place to place. When most missionaries talk about business as mission, they're meaning take your job and move overseas. And I include this in discussions, but sometimes when God is calling us to begin thinking about engaging with the gospel, we immediately go, well, let's move place. If we go back to the pyramid from last sermon, that's the top part of the pyramid. What's the middle part of the pyramid where God has you right now? Who are you supposed to be right here, right now? What can you start doing to obey him right now? I don't want to rule out that God might want some of us to go overseas, but I definitely think God wants 100% of us to be present in our work, wherever that is, whether that's here or there or anywhere. Where's God calling you to be vocal? Perhaps there's something unjust, immoral, or even illegal that's happening in your work. Maybe you feel this urge to speak up, but you're afraid to speak up. But we know that God is able to protect people in the hardest of circumstances. This is what we saw in the story of Abraham and Lot. They were in terrible situation, the worst imaginable, and yet God was able to pluck Lot out of that. Finally, where is God leading you to be a witness? There are thousands and thousands of people who will never darken the door of any church. Doesn't matter how great the music is. Doesn't matter if you have, smoke machines and lasers or whatever else. It doesn't matter how cool the church is. They're not going to come. God put you there for that person. What's stopping you from getting to know them? What's stopping you from building a relationship with them? What's stopping you from telling them about the hope that you have in Jesus? You in the marketplace might be exactly where God has you to be. Let me close this in prayer. God, I pray that as we think through the story of what you did with Paul, Apollos, Priscilla, and Aquila, through the various regions where they traveled, our culture programs us to think of the spectacular. And your call to obedience typically is less than spectacular. It's less than that image in our mind of how amazing it's going to be when we follow you. But that's exactly what you call us to, the daily disciplines, the moment by moment, prioritizing you, obeying you, following you in the small ways. This is what led Priscilla and Aquila to be a part of all of these amazing things. It was just a simple obedience and willingness to follow. So God, I pray that as we are thinking through, as we are asking for your guidance and direction in our lives, that you give us that heart of simplicity, that it wouldn't have to be the superlative of whatever we're seeking, but that we'd be content with wherever you have us, that we'd be planted wherever you have us, that we would be able to spread your name wherever you have us.